let's talk about consideration. So I am very much hoping that you have done the reading and that you have had a look at the desk lectures. If you haven't, we're going to get there through a conversation, because today I am not going to bring out a slide deck unless I absolutely need to. We are going to do some activities the whole way. So if you're listening to this at home because you weren't in class and you haven't listened to the desk lectures yet, now is a good time to stop and do that. If you are in the classroom, now is not a good time to stop and do that, because we'll do it with quite a bit of conversation. I don't know how this class will turn out as a recording. There could be long stretches of messing around, but I'll see what we can do. Another part of my problem is my first priority has got to be working through your assignments over the next couple of weeks. So spending huge amount of times editing to remove chunks of time in a video is unlikely to happen. So I'm also hoping that you will have some devices with you that you can connect to the internet. But I'm actually hoping that you will also be able to talk to each other about this. All answers are anonymous, and we're going to backtrack a little bit. I would like everybody to respond to this question. What's the most surprising thing? What is the thing that you just didn't see coming? What is the thing that you know now that you had no idea was even a thing to think about, 6 weeks ago? We're now in the beginning of week 5. That you like it. That's pretty cool. Most people don't expect to like it. That was supposed to be hidden for an answer or two, but I'll do that next time. I like it too. The distinction between offers and invitation to treat and the objective test. Invitation to treat, I remember just being like, even back in, 1984, when I first started to think about contracts, I just remember thinking, that's just weird. Never actually having turned my mind previously to the idea that somebody who is trying to sell something isn't actually the person who's offering it for sale. Invitation to treat, requesting others to make an offer. Yep. And that's exactly what an invitation to treat is. So we're going to talk quite a bit today about consideration and the idea of consideration being sufficient but not necessarily being adequate. I think actually this is probably in some ways the comment that summarises what surprised me most when I started studying law. Is I think I had always thought of law and justice as being kind of connected to each other, and this sort of idea of the way the law works and fairness being connected to each other, particularly the judge-made law for some reason. And I think sometimes we have that kind of unconscious bias. We're looking for the fair answer. And with the greatest respect to 400 years of the development of the common law, the approach has actually been about consistency rather than fairness. And it's often when judges are trying to be fair that they come out with the inconsistent or the strange results that make it difficult. And Carlisle and Carbolic smoke ball is probably a really good example of that, where the judges were trying to come up with a fair decision, but actually the facts themselves didn't lend themselves particularly well to a contract case. Postal rule. Actually, I've missed one in the middle. Fundamental part of commerce, social infrastructure. It's not the moral fibre. I think that's the same thing, the same part of that fairness conversation. Postal rule is something that's really easy to get ourselves caught up into. And you do need to know the rules. but I think it's less and less relevant because more and more communication is instantaneous. So I think, again, 1984, when I was studying, it was more likely than not that the post would be involved in the creation of a contract. But strangle forward, probably the wrong verb, but does feel like a strangulation, to 2018, and I think that that would be the rarity. Cool. So you warmed up. Let's keep... Oh, a little hard to read on that page, but so consideration. The classic definition is found in a case called Curry and Mesa. And it effectively states that a person to whom a promise is made must either confer a benefit on the promisor or must incur a legal detriment. Benefit, detriment, somebody needs to proofread their slides. Detriment is enough to demonstrate consideration. Is this true or false? So your options are true, that's a classic definition. Why would I lie to you? False, you need to be able to demonstrate that the benefit detriment is given as part of the bargain. False, however, if you can't find benefit detriment, then go and look for a bargain. Or it's true, provided the consideration is sufficient. Which of these is a true statement? Please excuse my typo. I'll have a look at how you're doing when we get to 10, then I'll ask you to chat amongst yourselves once you've had, well, if we need to. If it's 100% the right answer, we probably don't. So one of the reasons I like you to do it this way, and I know it feels a bit childish to some of you perhaps, is it's really easy to think, oh, it could be this, it could be that, and then you get confirmation bias. When I flip and I tell you the answer, you think, especially if it's one of the two you're weighing up, you're like, yeah, I would have chosen that. The actual act of choosing helps you get a sense of where you are. It's a waiting game. You do realise that I can't actually tell who gives the answers here. I have absolutely no way of telling. Oh no, we've killed a student already. Well, looking for one more person to have a go. Whoops, oh, wrong way. So we've got a bit of a spread. Overwhelming majority in the camp that says that it is false and that you need to be able to demonstrate that the benefit detriment is given as part of the bargain. Do you want to just have a chat with the other people at your table? So now with 5 people responding, we've got 5 people basically giving the same, and I'll tell you the correct answer. I don't want to spend too much time on a problem where most of you are in the right ballpark. So again, this is a fairly typical type of short answer question from an exam. Having said I'm not going to worry about exam questions, it is actually worth understanding. It's a pretty typical sort of short answer question, only they won't be multiple choice questions. And often they're quite driven by the language. So being actually quite precise around the use of language is really important. But we went through this last week and I had a kind of flow chart of thinking about consideration issues. And what is really important to understand is consideration has these two key elements. One is that there needs to be a promise. For every promise that is made, a price needs to be paid. So, and in your textbook, they explain this in a kind of very academic way, and they even end by saying, well, but seeing the courts, don't worry about it, it's just of academic interest anyway. But it does give you some opportunity to start thinking about the language complexity. So effectively what they say is for every promise that you want to have legally enforced, there needs to be a price paid for it. And in most bilateral contracts, two promises are made. And in order for each of those promises to be effective or enforceable at law, it needs to be given in exchange for the other promise. But the promise itself needs to be legally enforceable, and clearly neither are legally enforceable until both are legally enforceable. So it's a little bit of a mind puzzle in that way. And there are those two elements. One is that benefit detriment, the other is the bargain or exchange. So we're looking for that in order to find consideration each time. This idea of consideration being sufficient, you see that language all the time. So sufficient here means legally sufficient. And it means something that a court will acknowledge as being sufficient. Again, Curry and Misa is a good source for that. The Australian court, a case that says that the best definition of consideration is Curry and Misa is a High Court decision in McBeaton and McDivitt. And then if you really want to explore the idea of sufficiency, then you would be looking at Justice Kirby, as he was then, decision in Woolworths and Kelly. Okay. Oops, it might... There, it should be there. Yay, what do you know? So which of these definitions of consideration is the most accurate? With bonus points for those who can share some cases. So something required to ensure that a promise is binding. Without a promise, it will not be binding. Something present in all agreements, something given in return for a promise, or something given in return for a promise required to ensure that the promise is binding. So you can anchor with each other. Bit of a spread of answers again. So the two that seem to be most popular, oh, it's moving up and down. Well, people can change their minds. Okay, what if I tell you this one is not true? That this is not an excellent definition? For a couple of reasons. One is, people are going to change their marks, that's what's going to happen. Something present in all agreements. Agreement by itself is loose. So we've spoken about this a couple of times, how we can have a broader category of agreement, but contract or enforceable agreement is a subset of that larger agreement, or that larger class of agreements. Consideration is required to ensure that a promise is binding, but that alone is not enough. So, and without it, a promise won't be binding, absolutely. But the most true of these is that consideration is something given in return for a promise required to ensure that the promise is binding. So there's a link between the giving of the promise and the payment for that promise. That is what consideration is. Again, Beaton at McDivitt, Curry and Mesa. And then when we get into the exceptions, cases like Stilk and Myrick would also help you understand these concepts. Consideration must be sufficient, but it doesn't need to be adequate. What does that even mean? You have some options that you might like to share a little bit more broadly. Does it mean that consideration must be equal to the value of the promise? Does it mean that $1 would not be considered adequate consideration? Does it mean that the benefit or the detriment must be the same value as the promisor's promise? Or that consideration must be of something of value in accordance with the law? So we're down to two. Vast majority are correct. The benefit or the detriment must be the same value as the promisor's promise is effectively saying that the price needs to be a fair price, that the promise that is made, the price for that promise needs to be a fair value or an equal value. So most people who have sort of thought about economics at any point will understand the concept that in any transaction, one assumes that the thing that you're paying for is worth more to you than the money in your pocket, and that the money in your pocket is worth more to the other person than the thing that you're getting from them. If as a matter of economics, if you didn't think that there was greater value in keeping your money, in buying that thing or that service, then you may as well keep your money in your pocket. Now we know actually humans aren't always rational, and so sometimes we buy shoes. And that happens, but at the end of the day, there are big purveyors of fine red shoes all over the place who understand that those shoes are worth less to them in their shop than your money in their pocket would be in their pockets. But Woolworths and Kelly, I think, is really the place to go to really understand why a court can't do that, why it is not for a court to decide what something is worth. So the point of consideration is to make sure an agreement is legally enforceable, to make sure that a price is paid for every promise in order to make those promises enforceable. But it is not to determine the fairness of the agreement. So we'll get to Woolworths and Kelly in a subsequent one. We're sort of just still warming up here. But I think that's really important to understand that distinction. And because the language is unfamiliar, it needs to be sufficient, but it doesn't need to be adequate. A sufficient and adequate, like if you're asking, do you have adequate peas on your plate? Do you have sufficient peas on your plate? Do they actually mean the same thing? Do they mean different things? In this context, they mean different things. Adequate means fair or valuable in that context, and sufficient means legally sufficient, something that the law will recognise. So again, every topic has a little intro video that the lovely David Goodwin has put together, and he talks about the peppercorn rent that's paid by somebody or other in Bermuda every... Sorry, who is it? The Masonic Society. Thank you. And they have a ceremony where they show up with their peppercorn on a cushion. And it really is the turning of your mind to this is meant to be a legally enforceable arrangement. But the peppercorn itself has no real value. It's just been determined to be legally sufficient. So having said all of that, and to help me focus as we go through the next couple of problems, what's the thing, if anything, that's confusing you the most about consideration? I might just block the consideration of practical benefits shenanigans. There will be some practical benefit shenanigans coming up. Very pleased to see that. Okay, so relationship with estoppel, I'll look out for examples to talk about that. I do not know why it's called consideration, so I will take that as a question on notice. I do wonder if it is sort of linked to the way that we use the term consideration in ordinary language. You know, I'll take that into consideration. I'll have consideration of your feelings, this idea that there is some sort of duty associated with it. But I really don't know, so that's a question I'll need to take on advice. Where does it come into play? Again, all of these things, the spoiler alert for this particular subject is that all of the questions that we're really looking at ultimately go to whether a contract exists or not. So in order to have a contract, we need to have agreement, which is made up of offer and acceptance. If we can't find them, though, maybe we can find a meeting of the minds, a la Brambles. We need in that offer, the offer itself needs to be something that is capable of acceptance without variation, on the basis that when the person accepts it, that they know that their acceptance creates a binding obligation on them and a set of binding rights that they will then have. So wrapped up into the offer or the agreement will be the consideration. So the price that will be paid for the promise, and in turn, the promise that will be paid for that price. So consideration moves both ways. Both parties will usually make promises, and both parties will pay consideration for the promises that they receive. They're the same thing. So, and the other elements are intention and certainty. And when we have those things, and again, certainty is kind of wrapped up in this as well, in the sense that consideration is usually the set of obligations that you have that you take on in exchange for the set of rights that you're going to get in a contract. And so we need to be certain what those rights are and what those obligations are. So again, the agreement ties up the certainty as to what the rights and the obligations are. And then intention. Again, consideration is very much wrapped up in the idea of intention too, because the legal justification for requiring consideration is that we need to something that demonstrates that the parties had an intention to be legally bound, and that there was an exchange or a bargain that by making a promise or by paying consideration that gave rise to a right to have the benefit of the other party's promise kept and enforced. So it matters in the establishment of the contract, but yes, it's something that will be fought about in the courts, usually when somebody doesn't want to be a party to a contract, when they don't want to have it enforced against them. The difference between price and consideration, we'll keep talking about that, and hopefully that will become clearer over the course of the day. Price is just a limiting word in a sense, but price, it does overlap considerably with the idea of consideration. Second from the top, bargain element and benefit detriment element. Yes, both of them do need to be met. Of course, there will be some exceptions, because otherwise it'd just be too easy. And consideration is part of the technical framework of a contract. What is actually in the contract is up to the individuals. And the short answer to that is yes. So contract creates a private law between individuals, whether two or more parties. Those individuals need to have capacity, so they might not be natural persons, they might be legal persons. So a company is a legal person. An incorporated association is a legal person. A trust and a partnership are not legal persons. They're just ways of organising something. That's the sort of thing you'll do in company law at some point, but just trust me for the moment that we have natural persons and non-natural persons, and they can create rules as between themselves. Now, there are some things which we won't delve into that are not appropriate matters for a contract. So the subject matter of a contract can't be illegal, for example. The courts will not enforce your contract for child slavery. Like, doesn't matter how well written it is and how clear the consideration is, it will not enforce your contract for a hit taken on any of your lecturers. So there are, damn it, yeah, exactly. But you know, there's always the court of popular or social media or something. So yeah, the subject matter can be agreed between the parties, but each party needs to pay a price. Each party needs to contribute consideration. So if one party is just getting all of the benefits and doesn't pay anything, there is no contract. But what they have to pay just needs to be sufficient. It doesn't need to be adequate. So as long as they're paying something. So to pull that back, though, to the question down the bottom, the relationship with estoppel here is because estoppel is an equitable remedy, ultimately, and equity doesn't assist volunteers. So, well, it's a maxim. They're maxims, and I will not remember the equity cases that they come from. But basically what equity is doing is saying you have to come to the court with clean hands, another maxim, that you have to have paid a price before we're going to enforce an order against you. And so common law orders such as damages, for example, you can get damages or a right to terminate a contract as long as there's consideration at common law and as long as it's sufficient, doesn't need to be adequate. This is stuff that you will cover off much more fully in advanced contract law. But in order to get an equitable remedy, then effectively equity is saying, well, common law remedies aren't sufficient in this case. We need to actually stop you from doing something. So Beaton and McDivitt is a really good example of that, where ultimately that they found in that case that there was no consideration, but the owner of the land was stopped from claiming that there was no contract because of his particular actions that led to somebody believing that they were a subject to a contract. So it becomes an equitable remedy as opposed to a point of contract law. Harry and Hermione, let's have a problem. So in this particular one, Hermione's put an ad in the local newspaper selling her Quidditch equipment for $2,000. After inspecting it, Harry tells Hermione that he's very interested in the gear, but he doesn't have the cash. He'll have it within 7 days. Hermione tells Harry she will not sell to anyone else for 7 days as long as he pays her $100 immediately. So he does that. A few days later, Hermione decides that she doesn't want to sell her Quidditch gear after all. We have a number of options. Hermione has to keep the offer open for 7 days. So which of the following are the most true? Hermione is entitled to keep the equipment and give Harry back $100. Hermione has to sell things that she's advertised for sale. If Harry tries to pay Hermione for the equipment 9 days later, she has to sell it to him. Hermione is obliged to sell the equipment to Harry provided he pays within 7 days. Or last, Quidditch is awesome. Well, you're all wrong, because Quidditch is awesome. Okay, interesting spread here. And somebody's sucking up, that's awesome too. Okay, so this is the most popular answer. I'm going to tell you right away it's incorrect. So I'm not going to out anybody who's gone with that answer, but I'll tell you straight away it's incorrect. So now I want you to have a think about it and adjust. It seems to be going up. How is that even happening? And whilst Quidditch is awesome is a correct answer, it's certainly not the only correct answer. There is another correct answer on the page. So we've had a big swap around. Anybody who has either made that swap or was there right at the very beginning, you don't have to tell us, want to explain why they think this answer, Hermione is obliged to sell the equipment to Harry provided he pays within 7 days, why it's correct. Axel.
Well, I went with it to start off with because he's given Hermione $100.
He's
so he's sort of initiated, I suppose. The invitation to treat's there. And she's
So break it down for me, because you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So don't be nervous about it. Who's making the invitation to treat?
Hermione by placing the ad.
Yep.
He's responded to it. He says he doesn't have the cash on him, but he says, I'll give you the $100 and I'll have it.
So what would we classify that behaviour as?
Consideration, or is it more of a negotiation sort of thing?
Well, he's negotiating and he's making her
An offer.
an offer.
Yeah.
And
A
so
conditional offer, I suppose.
it's a conditional offer. He says he wants it,
Yeah.
but he can't pay now.
Yeah. So he's giving her sort of.
But he'll have it within 7 days. So
Yeah.
he's saying, well, you know, I'd like to offer to buy it, but I can't pay you for 7 days. And so she says, well, I won't sell it to anybody else for 7 days if you give me $100.
Yeah.
So what would we call that? It's a counter offer. Might be a counter offer, absolutely. At the end of the day, he's paid the money, so they've clearly reached agreement. We're not in any dispute as to whether there's an agreement. But what is a, you can come back and pay me for it in 7 days. I won't sell it to anybody else for 7 days. What is that? An option. Absolutely, it's an option. So what do we need? Is an option the same as, so the option part of this is the promise to hold the offer open for 7 days if you pay me $100 now. Is that part of the bigger contract to sell the Quidditch gear? No. Is it separate? Are they? It's not. So what is it then? Is it?
It's independent because there's no consideration that's been given for the promise to sell. And in fact, Harry tells Hermione that he's very interested in the gear. It's not entirely clear that
he's going to buy it.
That he's going to buy it.
But what is the promise? That's promise is not to sell it to someone else. So, but that promise to be enforceable, what do we need? Consideration. Do we have consideration here? Yes, we do, because Harry has paid. He's agreed to pay. She's effectively, it became, I think you're right there, Lexi, it is a counter offer, or it's an offer for a contract. I will not sell it to anybody else for 7 days if you pay me $100. Capable acceptance on its terms. You're absolutely right, where I suspect they could have a fight about whether he has to pay $2,000 or $1,900 for the Quidditch equipment at the end, but at the end of the day, we don't necessarily know, we don't have to worry about that for the purposes of this little exercise. So hence we end up with that being the correct answer, because none of the other, now, well, other than Quidditch is awesome, none of the others actually fulfill those criteria. So Hermione has to keep the offer open for 7 days. Keep the offer open to whom? To Harry, in exchange for the consideration. Yes, true, but this example down the bottom is a more accurate way of saying that. So again, you don't get multiple choice questions, but this might be a pass response where this is a credit or a distinction response. I'll go to James first.
I guess I can see how that's the case, actually. I'm just rethinking it. I chose the first one.
Well, you weren't wrong, you just weren't as right as Axel.
Nice.
Sorry.
That's fine.
And 62% of your colleague.
Yeah. I feel like the first one is technically better language to describe it, though, because all that has been promised is that the offer will be kept open specifically for Harry for 7 days.
Yeah, well, it doesn't actually, you're right though, both of them are loose.
Yeah.
So it doesn't say, it says Hermione has to keep the offer open for 7 days. it's not really clear what offer, and it's not clear that it is for Harry. And so if you hadn't been clever enough, which clearly you are, to recognise that Hermione's advertisement was an invitation to treat, I can't be sure with an answer like that what you're going for. And again, with these multiple choice, you're kind of looking for the best on the basis of what you've got. Where Hermione is obliged to sell the equipment to Harry if he pays within 7 days. We're a little unclear as to what that price would be, but that's fine.
Yeah, so why is she obliged to sell it to Harry? She just said she'll keep the offer open, not just sell it to him. She can still not accept the offer.
Yeah.
No, she can't. No, well, an offer. Actually, that raises a misunderstanding that's important. So, an offer. Once an offer is out there in the world, an agreement is made the minute that it's accepted.
Yeah, but she's
So what she's saying, no.
To buy the, yeah.
So,
Hermione just not accept
but
it?
Harry's saying, well, she's saying, I will sell it for $200 or $2,000. So it's an invitation to treat, but they've had a conversation, right? So she's saying, I will keep it open. I won't sell it to anybody else for that period of time. Yeah, I can see where you're going.
She says, I won't sell it to anyone else.
Yeah.
So he said if it gets to day 7 and she goes, actually no, I don't want to sell my equipment, here's your $100 back. It's the word where it's used obliged. I think I've got the same principle.
Yeah, no. I can see where you're going with it. It's part of it is the constraints of having only 500 characters to put a question in, and so. But what this question is going for is, does that $100 create the option? So, and the option by its nature, like in order. So, what's the consideration? Let's put it the other way. What would the consideration for the $100 be?
Not to sell it to anyone else.
The
promise not to sell it to anybody
The
else.
promise to not sell it to anybody else, but the corresponding part of that is, and to sell it to Harry if he fronts up with the price.
Oh, I know about that, Harry.
So,
Yeah, I'd say it's a pretty strong argument.
you're a wizard, Harry. You're a wizard.
Some judicial wizardry in there.
No, I can see where you're going with it. I think it's good legal logic. And I'm going to need to word my questions very carefully, I can see that. The intention was that this one is correct. I still think it is the better answer across the lot of them, but I will pay your approach to the problem. Is that hand up or?
You should just add a bit onto the end. She's obliged to sell it to him after 7 days if she still chooses to do so.
No, no. Well,
But that's not my point, because my point is she can just not accept the offer.
Yeah.
so his point is that if it's an offer.
Point, has he?
I think he does have the better point. I can see it, we need more words to establish what the content of the option would be.
Yeah.
But again, on the basis that you guys are clearly going to be litigators and be pulling all of these things apart, those of you who want to write the contract would want to be very clear what the terms of that option were, and that really the obligation needs to be twofold. One is, and you would want some certainty about price, because I think there would be a fight over whether the price is $1,900 or $2,000 for the Quidditch equipment. But you would want to be very clear on what it is that price is. Good. Questions, concerns, frustrations? Elliot, you had another question, but it came out in that conversation.
That was my question.
Okay, let's try another one. Janet lives in Mildura. Brad urgently requires Janet to fly to Melbourne to sign some contracts. Janet tells Brad she can't possibly come, she can't afford to pay for the airfare, and that Brad should come to her. Brad promises to pay Janet $500 if she flies to Melbourne. After the contracts have been signed, Brad tells Janet that he doesn't have the $500. Has consideration been provided for the agreement? Options. Yes, Janet's act of flying to Melbourne is consideration for the payment of $500. Yes, Brad made a promise to pay Janet $500. No, Brad hasn't paid Janet and does not have the money, so therefore, I think that's supposed to be, Brad has not suffered a detriment. No, it was a gift from Brad to Janet. Well, the two places where it's likely to take place, I think it's reasonable to assume that everything in this problem happens in the state of Victoria, given that the two named places, both Mildura and Melbourne, are within the confines of this great state. Okay, we do have a little bit of a split. Interestingly, we've got a few people saying it was a gift from Brad to Janet, and I don't understand how that can make any real sense, given that Janet's paid for her airfare, and I'm not sure what would be a gift. So if that was you, think about that one. And if it's making sense to you as to why that's the answer, explain it to me, because I think that will help me do a better job of writing questions. Brad hasn't paid Janet and he doesn't have the money, so he hasn't suffered a detriment. So again, we need a benefit detriment. He has received the benefit. She did what he asked her to do. He hasn't suffered a detriment. His detriment would be, if there was a contract, the payment of the money, the keeping of the promise. Nobody's gone with, he made a promise, therefore it should be enforced, which is good because we usually need a little bit more. The first one is the correct answer. So Janet's act of flying to Melbourne is consideration for the payment of $500. So going back to the person who said it's confusing what's the difference between price and consideration earlier, price is usually something that we attach to a monetary amount. And for every payment or promise to pay money, there needs to be consideration. So the price for the price. And I think consideration is a broader term. It doesn't really make sense to say, well, what's the price for you're going to pay me for that $500? Instead, the consideration for the $500 is you organising your own way from Mildura to Melbourne. I hope that helps. Let's keep going. All right, we're going to do a few on woolen mills. There are actually a group of questions now, so you will see them, I think, all on the one page. But yeah, so we're going to talk about woolen mills, in which the Privy Council upheld the High Court's decision that there was no contract between the parties. So some true or false ones, just to get your heart started. The first of these is, the High Court held that it was not necessary for there to be a quid pro quo between the parties. Yes, no, maybe, only maybes. I feel like this should be one, because we've come across this case a couple of times. You are right, those of you who said it is false. So the point of woolen mills is that we do need to see that bargain requirement, a quid pro quo, that the consideration needs to relate to the promise that was made and be in response to the promise that was made. In some ways, even though this is in contract law terms, a relatively new decision, and this sort of separating out of the two elements, the quid pro quo and the bargain requirement, matching with also the benefit detriment requirement. If you think about the things that are not consideration, that you can see, and the cases, for example, around past consideration not being good consideration, you can see that there has always been this necessity to link the promise that you make or the detriment that you suffer to the benefit you're receiving or the promise that you're receiving. That there needs to be a link between those two things in time. The Privy Council held that a contract will be established if there has been a request to perform an act. Okay, think about this. You actually know the answer to it, I know from the conversation that we've been having. Apply the logic. Interesting. 50-50, you fence sitters, you. All right, anybody want to out themselves on being on the side of true? I'd like to just debate it out, really. I mean, clearly you're in good company. Somebody who, I need a true and a false. I want one of each of you.
I'll be false.
You're false?
Yeah, false.
We got somebody here. What, you've just looked at who thinks it's false and you've decided to just go with it.
It's going to be a ruse.
It's like it's, yeah. Why do you think it's false, Elliot?
Well, I think it's false because just a request to perform an act does not make a contract. We need some consideration and something from the other side.
So what do we need to form a contract?
Agreement, consideration, certainty and intention.
Yes, so we have a request. That is not an offer and acceptance. So despite the overwhelming now view that this answer is true, so for those people who are fast forwarding through the recording and just making a note at this point as they see what the slide is looking like and not listening to my voice even on chipmunk fast forward, you guys are in a ruse here to actually just give them a bad result. Yes, this is what the Privy Council found. Oh my goodness, wouldn't it be cool if you could do this in your exams? Like if instead I could just be at this panel with all of this colour and movement happening. I would enjoy that. Questions, concerns, frustrations, given that so many of you are saying true, be careful with that photo. Let's continue. As the statements were held to be policy announcements, the bargain aspects of consideration was not satisfied. In Woolen Mills, true or false? I was supposed to have the exam written by today. I haven't written it yet. You guys are inspiring me now. I know, I asked for an extension. Never done that before. Just too much to do. Again, do we want to argue it out? The force of the majority here is that that is a true statement. Anybody want to explain why?
I'm not sure that I'll do necessarily a good job, but the policy announcement is not, doesn't constitute a promise that can be accepted, an offer that can be accepted, because a policy announcement is just a statement of a general statement of intention. It's not addressed to anybody in particular, nor is it addressed to everyone. as an offer? Something of that
Absolutely. So ultimately, that's the key finding in this decision.
nature?
A key finding in Woolen Mills was that there's a government a department and it has a budget, and its job is to do things to try and achieve the government policy. The big policy was, let's get people to buy as much wool, Australian grown wool, as we possibly can. And one of the ways that it did that is if you bought Australian wool, then you got a rebate. And effectively what that was is that you would pay less tax. You would get a contribution towards your purchase costs, which would increase your profits. But it was one of many things that they were doing, including stockpiling wool, for example, to create an uplift in the price and creating, it's one of the most successful, the Wool Corporation is one of the world's most successful cartels originally, just pulling together that wool and controlling the price internationally. And after a while, they decided that they weren't going to do that anymore. But again, so for those of you who are interested in governance, it's quite an interesting decision to think about, well, when is a government making a promise that is a policy promise? And when is a government making a promise that it intends to be bound by and could be sued on? And I'm sure, sorry? That possibly never. You will see a line in these cases. It's pretty hard to get the government to keep its promise by using contract law. Just even if you think about cases like we spoke last week about Crown and Clark. So yeah, it sent out a reward. It says you give us information that leads to this end result, but they haven't said unless we ask you for a different reason. But yeah, I'm seeing a consistency there across the cases.
One has to wonder how much legal precedent has been set just by the government being slippery.
One has to wonder how much legal precedent has been set as a consequence of a slippery government. I do like slippery. Well, was it Kevin Rudd who was talking about, was it Tony Abbott, core promises and non-core promises or something or other? That's not all that long ago. Can't remember, it was one of them. I mean, someone different altogether. We'll have a break when we finish this line. The benefit detriment requirement was satisfied by the Australian Woolen Mills Act of Purchasing Wool. Yes, no, true, false. Absolutely no way. Am I giving it away? Oh. Anybody else want to tip themselves over into the false bucket and join all the other people who are incorrect? The benefit detriment was satisfied. One of the reasons why this case is important is because it shows us that you can have the benefit detriment test satisfied, but unless the activity, the benefit detriment, is linked to the promise that was made, unless there is a quid pro quo, we don't have consideration and therefore we don't have a contract. So again, it's a tricky question, and it's there to really give me the opportunity to highlight that point as much as anything else. But what is important is this case, even though ultimately Woolen Mills didn't have a contract, so as a consequence, it's obiter where we get more description of what the benefit detriment test is and how it works. Yes?
I would argue that it's false.
You will argue that it's false. Please explain to me why it's false.
Because Australian woolen mills were going to purchase that wool. The wool was going to be purchased anyway, so there's no detriment.
No, there's no quid pro quo because they were going to purchase the wool anyway.
Yep.
But there is a detriment. They paid for the wool. And the benefit is that the government, they bought Australian wool, so the government got what it wanted out of that contract.
Doesn't the
So-
detriment have to be related to the specific bargain in question?
Well, and that's the point. So the bargain, the quid pro quo point, wasn't achieved, but the benefit detriment, the straight, did you do something in exchange? Well, no, not in exchange. Did you suffer a detriment that gave rise to the other party getting the benefit that they wanted? And it's because of this case that we pull out that benefit detriment needs to be related to the quid pro quo, to the bargain. It needs to be related to this contract.
Okay, so it's still classified as a detriment even when it's not a detriment with respect to the case in question, or the bargain in question?
Well, you've got to think of them as two separate elements. Both tests need to be met. And usually what we're doing is, because if there's no benefit detriment, that's easy. That's really easy to check. And so you do that, and if the answer is no, we don't need to move on. But if the answer is yes, we've got a benefit detriment like we do here, the next question becomes, is it a quid pro quo? Is it related to the agreement? Is it related to this specific promise? Or is it generic in some way? Now, I know it's tricky, and that's why I've got this question here, to make sure that you understand that there are 2 points in the consideration. There are 2 parts of that test. But you're not changing your answer, you're sticking with me, and you've got some fans who are with you as well. A request was made by the Commonwealth for woolen manufacturers, including woolen mills, to purchase wool. I think the better answer here is false, that it was a policy. So they weren't actually asking anybody to do this, and this is ultimately the point that they were successful on. They're just like, but if you do, we've got a policy of paying you a rebate, which we could change at any time. But for now, this is where it's not it's an encore promise. All right, do you want to take a break for a little while? 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back. We'll do another couple of little problems like this one, and then we'll put an even more complex one in front of you. You have a break too, you lovely people at home.